All right, we are at 9:01, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. My name is Deanna Mayer, and I am the Executive Director of the Helix School in San Rafael, California. Helix is a non-public school serving autistic students ages 5 to 22 and beyond. We're a small school with a big mission, not only of providing our own students with an evidence-based academic program rooted in wraparound care, including speech, occupational, and behavioral services. But we also really have a mission to create a difference in the larger autism space. And offering services such as this speaker series is just one way that we try to connect our families and practitioners with cutting edge information and resources. And today I'm really excited to welcome Linda Murphy. Linda is a speech pathologist, and she is the author of the Declarative Language Handbook. She founded Peer Projects, a clinic in Beverly, Massachusetts, dedicated to helping kids and families by using a positive, thoughtful communication style that emphasizes understanding patience, respect, and kindness. Linda has been working with individuals with social learning differences for over 30 years. She leads trainings on the topic of supporting communication and learning across social learning styles, and she authored the Declarative Language Handbook and Co-Regulation Handbook. She is a certified early intervention specialist. She's trained in natural language acquisition, Gestalt Language Processing, and she holds Level 1 and Level 2 certificates in training from PDA North America. She lives north of Boston with her husband and their two busy, lovable boys who are now entering their teenage years. So welcome, Linda, and I am going to turn it over to you.
I thank you so much for having me. I'm really grateful just to have the opportunity to connect with your school. It looks like such a special place, and I like seeing the sunshine out your window. It's cold here now, but I'll pull up my slides so that we can start. And um, so I could talk and talk and talk and talk about declarative language, of course, but what I hope to do today is just give an introduction, like an overview with some examples, and then we'll have time to talk and answer any questions. Um, but I guess like where I'd like to start even is with my title, and I think I'll talk about this as I go, but just I wrote Declarative Language Handbook it was published in 2020, like March 7th, I think 2020. So kind of right before the world shut down. And I think it got a lot of attention, like especially because of the pandemic. People were just really looking for things that they could do to help their kids who were at home. So I've just been really grateful for the attention that it's gotten because for me, it's always been a really important tool that I knew about. And I wrote the book just because I felt like this is something that anybody could learn and why aren't more people talking about it? So that was kind of my motivation. But what's really cool is I just think that the more I practice it, the more I think about it, the more I meet people and talk about different applications of declarative language, like my appreciation and understanding of it just goes deeper and deeper and deeper. Um, and and even so since 2020, like all the ways that I think about it are just much more nuanced and different now, which I appreciate. But one of the biggest things, which we'll talk about, is the reason I think declarative language is so effective is because it supports social information processing across different social learning styles. So if you are an autistic individual communicating with a person who's not autistic or vice versa, we just experience the world differently. And sometimes we just need a way to understand each other that's respectful. And this really and truly, I believe, is what declarative language does. It just really helps us bridge the gap and understand each other better. So I just wanted to tell you a little bit about me. I just as a professional, as a parent, as a person, like it's really important to me that I'm always growing and learning. So even as I said, like I feel like I keep understanding things better and differently since I wrote the book. But just my values as an individual and a professional is that I always want to make authentic connections with individuals, families, and teams that I work with. I always want to build positive relationships and just have respect for the individuals, the families, the professional teams that I work with. I'm always going to approach everything with the developmental framework. So when I'm working with a client or a student, that means I'm going to meet them where they're at in development, not where the chronological neurotypical age norm says they should be, but rather just where are we at this moment in time, in development, but also in terms of self-regulation. But then the other thing I really think about too is, we as professionals or caregivers or parents are also at different places in our journey. Um, and so no matter where you as an individual wanting to learn more, where you are in your journey, like I always want to meet people there as well. So if this is a new idea for you, like that's great. But if you've been using declarative language for a while and you're ready to go deeper, that's great too. But those are just some things that are important to me because I know I continually learn from others. So, for example, from the neurodivergent community or really listening to autistic voices that have helped me deepen my understanding of things. And I know a lot of people have been patient with me as I learn more. So I always want to reciprocate and give that back to other people. So no matter where you are, it's all good. This is an area of passion for me, but I meet you where you are in your journey. Um, Seth Godin is, well, he calls himself an author, entrepreneur, and most of all, a teacher. And he's somebody that I had followed as a small business owner, but I just feel like he has nice wisdom that we can all benefit from. And he focuses on the effective spread of ideas and changing everything. And this is one quote that I came across a little over a year ago that he wrote, and I just really love it and take it to heart. So I wanted to share it with you as well. Learning is about becoming incompetent on our way to getting better. If you're not open to the tension that is caused by knowing you could do better, it's unlikely you're willing to do the work to get better. As you're doing that work, there's the satisfaction it brings, but also the knowledge that just a moment ago you weren't any good. So I feel like, I've been doing this for a very long time, but sometimes I'm going along and I'm suddenly humbled because I realize there's a gap in my knowledge or there's something that I don't yet know. Um, and I always just try and know that, okay, that's part of the journey. If it wasn't hard or there wasn't tension for me, that would mean I wasn't growing and I wasn't trying to learn more or figure out what I don't yet know. And so again, like if the idea of declarative language is new for you and you feel that tension, know that it might be uncomfortable, but it's also a good thing because it means that you are trying to be the best that you can with the knowledge that you are learning. So in general, I know I just mentioned the idea of social information processing, but processing is an idea that I really and truly think about so much in all that I do. Um, yeah, I think like I've always appreciated the idea of processing information, but especially I think as I listen to more and more autistic voices, we really do hear them say how their processing style or their processing may be different. For example, from mine as somebody who's not autistic. Just to give you a couple examples is, they might need more time to process information. They might not process information linearly. So, for example, something might happen and it leads somebody to remember something that happened a little while ago, and then you just begin to process that piece of information. There is an autistic man, or he's called the autistic advocate, Karen Rose, who talks a lot about monotropism or the idea of flow state, which I won't go into today, but I think that that's really interesting and important to understand in terms of autistic individuals. But where we enter is just really and truly appreciating that processing is different across social learning styles. And I have a blog post that I wrote. The link will be in your handouts, and I call it Cognitive Rigidity or Processing Time Needed. And, an important idea for me, and that I hope you also can appreciate, is that quite often people might call our autistic or neurodivergent students or learners rigid or say they're not flexible. And I really want us to challenge that because, in my experience, it's not that an individual is rigid or not flexible. It's just that they need more processing time than I might to appreciate all the various pieces at play. And also, in my experience, when we give an individual the information that they might need and also the time that they might need to process, people really do join and come along. But it's up to us to hold back on that assumption and that language that they're rigid, or enter with that negative mindset about that person and rather kind of flip that a little bit to think, you know what, it's not that they're rigid, it's just that they need more time to appreciate what's happening and gather all the information that I might. And it would be good for me to give them that time, or good for all of us rather. Um, so as part of that blog post or blog series that I mentioned, I have this handout. And again, this is something that I really think about a lot. And it's not that my learner is rigid. That's not the language we want to use, but rather we want to think about the idea that my learner needs more time to process and integrate new information. And it will be better for all of us for lots of different reasons if I respect and embrace this aspect of their learning style by building in the time that they need. Um, and it was interesting because as I thought about this idea, a colleague shared with me that this is actually an old idea, of course, that John Piaget described, and he calls it assimilation, accommodation, and equilibration. So all of us, when we learn new information, we need that time to assimilate, accommodate, and equilibrate. But what might vary is just the time that each person needs to do it. So as I go back to declarative language, we're really thinking about processing. And I wrote Declarative Language Handbook, as I said, because this is just something that is such an effective tool and that in my experience, people weren't talking about, but yet I knew its power. I knew how respectful it was with individuals. And as I think more about processing, I see that it's a concrete tool that we can use immediately to support an individual's processing of information and create mutual understanding. So that is why it works. It's because it's supporting processing in the environment and across communication partners. So sometimes where I like to start is just this moment in time. So this is me with my boys years ago because they are now 15 and almost 13. But what I love about declarative language is it's just about slowing down in each moment in time or within your daily routines, whatever they might be, and just realizing that if you were to think about what you say and how you say it, you really can create these moments of social learning, of connection, of mutual understanding, of getting to know each other. But it really and truly just takes us slowing down in that moment and thinking about what we want to say and how we say it. So in this moment in time, I'm hungry and I could say, give me the cereal, or I could instead pause and create an opportunity that supports our processing of social information in that moment. As a speech language pathologist, I think a lot about social communication. Um, and really, it's such a complicated process because we need to process and navigate so many things to be successful social communicators. So to give you just some ideas, we have to be able to see the big picture in any moment. So that might mean in relation to the environment that we're in. So for example, if I walk into a movie theater, I really have to zoom out and figure out, okay, where are we at in the movie? Like, are we at the trailers? Is the movie all already underway? Um, in order to determine, like, can I talk? Should I be quiet? How can I find my seat? So there's so many things that we just have to notice environmentally and contextually. But also in the big picture, I think about across time. So for example, if you meet another person, in the big picture, it really matters what their past is, either immediate past or further back past, or their future. And that even might be their immediate plans after I meet that person. To be successful, we really need to be able to just have an appreciation for those things. So, for example, if I see somebody and I can tell that they're in a rush, that tells me in the immediate future they have to get somewhere. And as a social communicator in that moment, it's important for me to just recognize those cues and maybe wrap it up or don't talk and talk and talk. So the big picture for me is contextually, environmentally, but also across time. We have to be able to read nonverbal communication. So I just mentioned one example, but reading nonverbal communication is never just about a static form of nonverbal communication as it might be in a photo, but rather it's really the dynamic nonverbal communication moment to moment that might happen within a dynamic exchange. We have to be able to problem solve in real time. So I know a lot of times our students are good at problem solving hypothetically, but in order to be successful in that dynamic social moment, sometimes we have to know how to manage a crisis or an unexpected event or problem solve in real time, which is a different skill. We have to be able to take the perspective of others. So just appreciate where others might be coming from, what their world experience might be, what their cultural or family history might be. All that matters as we socially communicate with other people. We have to be able to self-regulate or manage our impulses. We all have lots of thoughts and feelings, but we can't always act on our thoughts and feelings. Sometimes self-regulation just means that we have to pause and take a break or walk away so that we don't act on an impulse. But all of that can become really hard. And to be successful social communicators, we have to adjust in the moment to change. And a lot of people might call this being flexible, like we want all our students to be flexible to go with the flow. But the underlying process of what's going on there is that there's new information at hand, and we have to incorporate that, adjust, and move on accordingly, which can be hard. So as I always thought about all those different areas of social communication, I pulled out 5 foundation skills that to me can really help develop those skills. Each of these foundation skills also require efficient processing and integration of social information. And I'll go through each of these briefly today, but just so you know, in my book, there's a chapter for each of these areas where I talk about it a little bit more. So first, in order to be successful, we just have to be able to observe what's going on in our environment. We have to be able to visually reference. So that just means take in the visual information that we see, which is very different from making eye contact. But rather it's noticing the context we're in, maybe noticing the nonverbal communication of the other person, being able to interpret what that information means, and then being able to respond to it. Episodic memory is really important, and this just means that we are able to reflect on our past and how it might apply to the here and now. So, for example, anytime we're in a new situation, chances are we can reflect back on our past experiences and find a similar but different situation that can help us know how to navigate this place that we're in right now. A concrete example could just be an airport. If you were to go to a brand new airport that you had never been at before, you probably would be able to navigate it in a good enough way because you've been to other airports and you can kind of pull that template. But if you weren't able to pull that template of airport, then each and every time you were in a new situation, whatever it might be, it would feel really scary because you wouldn't be able to get your footing. So being able to access our episodic memory is really important in terms of helping us feel safe and regulated as we enter novel situations. And then the flip side of reflecting on memories is just planning ahead for the future. So anytime something important has happened, chances are you store that as an important memory, knowing that it will help you plan in the future. So, for example, if you were to start a new job and you gave yourself 10 minutes to get there, and then you realized it actually took 20 minutes with traffic, the next day you're going to update your knowledge and plan differently or plan for the future differently based on what happened in that present moment. For successful social communication, it's important too that we appreciate different opinions or that we feel comfortable with differences, whatever they might be, and feel comfortable taking the perspective of others. And I think what's really important is that this goes both ways. So it's not just about our students appreciating somebody else's opinion, but it's also important that we appreciate theirs and understand where they're coming from. What I really, how I really think about different opinions now too is just that anytime somebody shares a new idea, a different opinion, it's going to be different information, maybe from what our student has understood. And therefore, they might need time to integrate that information, process it, and then appreciate it. Um, and so another thing that I really think about is, of course, we always want our students to be able to take the perspective of others, but really and truly the best place to start is just helping them appreciate that different people might think different ways, and that's okay. Like, I don't need to change your mind. I just want to help you feel comfortable with the difference that's between us. We want our students to feel okay making mistakes because we know mistakes is how we learn. I think students might take mistakes really hard for lots of different reasons. It might be hard to go outside one's comfort zone and try new things because that person might not feel as competent with the new information. Making mistakes might feel really hard because the skill that might be tricky is actually knowing how to fix a mistake or make a repair in the moment, which is a much more dynamic skill than just memorizing a right answer. But making mistakes is so important for learning and growing. We know this for so many different things. So we really want to help our students feel okay in that space that that mistakes are okay and manageable, even if they might be uncomfortable at times. And then the last area is just thinking in alternatives and possibilities. And this just means that we can all really appreciate that there's more than one way to do something. And again, kind of like appreciating different opinions, this also goes both ways. Like, our students might do something in a different way than we would, but that's okay and that's great because there's always different ways to do the same thing. Just a quick example for this might be if you notice that you have a flat tire and you have to get somewhere. Um, in that moment in time, you might think of all the different ways that you could solve that problem. Like, you could call AAA, maybe you could take public transportation instead, maybe you could call a friend for a ride, maybe you could bike. But the more that a person can think in alternatives and possibilities when faced with the problem, the more they can stay regulated when faced with an unexpected event. I think our kids and students may become dysregulated or panic when they have one and only one solution, and that solution isn't possible. That's when they might go into crisis mode, and because it can be really scary. So the more we can kind of help that skill develop, the more successful our students can be, and the more regulated and comfortable and safe they can feel as they enter unknown territory or unexpected events. So as I share about all those different areas, I of course will follow it up with the good news, which is that declarative language really is a gift that we can give to our students and our communication partners within each interaction that really and truly helps foster and support these areas. I'm going to get into examples for declarative language, but always where I like to start is what declarative language is not, or the opposite of declarative language, which is imperative. So imperative language tells people what to do or say. It's questions or directions with a right or wrong answer. Imperative language is not flexible. It doesn't give information to our students. It just aims to get something from them. So for example, get them to say something, get them to do something. And because it doesn't give information, it's not supporting understanding of what may be confusing within a social interaction or within a social context. It places demands on an individual to perform in the moment. So as I said, it may ask someone to say something, to do something, but also imperative language has a demand of time pressure. Quite often when an imperative is used, it's with the intention of right now, do this right now. And therefore it doesn't have regard for processing time or processing differences. Imperative language is not experience sharing in nature, so that just means it doesn't talk about our memories together, our plans, our ideas, our feelings. It doesn't have any of that rich language that builds relationship, and therefore it doesn't create safety and connection. And for all these reasons, imperative language can create stress. So it's the type of communication that can place all these demands, create stress on our students, and many of whom are especially sensitive, really feel the stress. And then what can end up happening is the individual might enter fight or flight or something like that. And then that gets interpreted as challenging behavior. So I think like what is always important to think about is our language can really matter because we can communicate in a way that creates stress and perhaps leads to challenging behaviors, or we can communicate in a different way to support that self-regulation and processing along the way. But I want to give you some examples of imperatives just so you can feel it. Get in line. What color is your shirt? Say hello to grandma. Look at me. And what did I say? So again, those are all imperative statements because there's a right and wrong answer. We're asking somebody to do something or to say something right in that moment in time. There's that time pressure also. So in contrast, declarative language is a comment. It's thinking out loud and sharing your inner voice, your plans, your ideas. You're sharing your observations. It really will invite that experience sharing. So just you're talking about your connections, the things that you're doing together, that you're noticing together, that you remember together. It doesn't place demands on individuals. It's very invitational. So therefore, it gives space for personal agency and autonomy, which is really especially important for some of our students. It's flexible. There's many possible responses to a declarative statement that are right and good. So it really gets at that alternative thinking or possibilities right away. It supports individuals to see the big picture and it empowers individuals. So instead of asking somebody to follow a direction, we are giving them the information and empowering them to be problem solvers in that moment. And the other part of declarative language, it's not ever going to be just the words that we use, but it's also our tone of voice, our nonverbal communication, our pace, the level of our directness are also other pieces that we can pull into our declarative statements to make it successful for that exchange in the moment. So communication is a whole package. It's never just the words. There's so much underneath. But I think as you start to practice declarative language, just thinking about the words that you're using is a great place to start because it helps you slow down, where then you can think about all the other pieces as well. So I wanted to change those imperatives into declaratives so you can kind of feel the difference. Instead of saying get in line, you could say something like, it looks like it might be time to go into school. So in that moment, all you're doing is just inviting that student to visually reference maybe the context or the environment. Maybe as you guide them on what to observe or what to reference, they notice a line forming at the door, they process it, and then they take that next step because they understand what it means. But again, that's very different from get in line, which tells them what to do and tells them what to do right now. Instead of saying, what color is your shirt? You could say something like, hey, we have the same color shirt. I like red too. And in that moment, you most certainly still are teaching colors. You're teaching colors even in the idea that the same color can look different ways, which might be generalization. And you're also really beginning to form your relationship just by spotlighting what you have in common with that person. Instead of say hello to grandma, you might just comment on the change in the environment. Oh, wow, grandma is here. And then again, you can give time and space for that person or that student to process that information and then visually reference the door or visually reference to notice that grandma is entering. And then it can be up to that student to decide how they want to respond or how they might want to greet. You know, they might run over and give her a hug. They might wave. They might say hi. And all of those are good and great because they're unique to that relationship, unique to that student, and we're not dictating what that greeting should look like. Instead of saying, look at me. So Of course, sometimes we want our student or our kids to notice something because it's important. But when we say, look at me, we're just placing pressure on them to take in visual information before they might be ready, which can cause stress. But instead, if you wanted to indicate that there's something important to notice, you could say something like, I'm worried you might miss something if you don't look. Or you could say, I have something important to show you when you're ready. So in that way, you are letting them know why it's important to visually reference, and you're also giving them the time and space to do it as they're ready to take in that new piece of information, which overall will support their processing. Um, what did I say? So I always joke because maybe sometimes I've said this to my kids when I feel like they're not listening, but I feel like this is such a hard question, especially when we ask it to individuals who maybe have language vulnerabilities, because there could be so many reasons why they can't answer this question. We might feel like they're not listening, but really and truly, like maybe they didn't understand, maybe they forgot, maybe there's a background noise that got in the way. And at the end of the day, what's most important is that we want successful communication. It's not that they are listening all the time. It's just that we want our communication to be successful with each other. So if we notice that somebody maybe didn't hear what we said, we could just say something like, I'm wondering if you heard what I said, or I'm not sure you heard me. Let me know if not, because I'm happy to repeat it. When you use a declarative statement like that, what you're really doing is just spotlighting that there was a potential breakdown in communication and giving opportunity for repair or self-advocacy, which is the skill that will really take that student further in life. It's not that we always have to listen and hear everything, but it is really helpful when we notice that we haven't heard something and we know how to access the information after the fact. So sometimes what I've seen when I use a statement like that, like, oh, I'm wondering if you heard what I said, or I'm not sure you heard me, the individual might say, oh, I didn't. Can you say it again? Or I heard you, but I didn't understand. Or I heard you, but I forgot. Or I wanted to hear you, but the truck went by outside. Again, you're giving them that opportunity to self-advocate, but even sometimes what you end up doing is getting more information about their learning style and obstacles, which will take us all farther as we have that information and then can support further self-advocacy for the student in the future. So declarative language is a really powerful tool. We just have to try it, trust it, and be patient. And I think this is one of the hardest things about declarative language. Well, it's one of the hardest things, but it's also like one of the most wonderful things is that it's on us to make the change or to be the change. I think quite often people focus on the student and what they want the student to do differently, but this is all about us and us knowing that we can do things differently that will support a stronger outcome for that student and a better connection between us where we understand each other better. But it just means starting out, we have to slow down and take that time as we can to think about what we say and how we say it. And we always want to remember that the point of declarative language is to create ongoing dialogue that shares information respectfully, kindly, and generously. So it should never be a trick used to meet an underlying get. That's never what I want it to be. But rather we're working to change the communicative landscape from the ground up to really and truly support that social information processing and foster connection. This is one resource that you can access on my website. It's a declarative language cheat sheet, and it just gives different types of words that you can use and some examples in there of how to just create different declarative statements. And there's a chapter on this in my book as well, but that's just a handy printout if it's helpful to you. And I want you to know too that declarative language doesn't work every time you use it, and that's okay and expected. Communication is imperfect, so no matter what type of communication we use, there's going to be breakdowns or misunderstandings that we then have the opportunity to repair. This is just a list of quick tips that I think about a lot when there's been a breakdown or if I've made a declarative statement and the person didn't respond or respond in the way that I was thinking they might. So these are things that I know can repair the communication breakdown or strengthen that communication together. Sometimes it really helps just to get a little bit closer to the person that we're talking with. They just might be too far away and our language didn't travel the distance. Sometimes it helps to wait a bit longer if we've jumped in too quickly. We can always add a gesture or nonverbal communication to support comprehension. I find it really, really helpful to just secure the individual's attention first. So that might be calling their name. That might be saying something like, oh, I have something to tell you when you're ready. Maybe removing distractions as best you can if they're playing with something and that Lego, for example, is more interesting than your words. Like to do that, I might say something like, oh, I have something important to tell you. Would it be okay if I held that Lego for a minute while I told you my message and then I can give it back to you? So I'm always respectful of them. I'm just using declarative language around the edges to help secure their attention in a respectful way so that I can deliver the message that's important in that moment. Sometimes I have to give more information. So maybe I've made a declarative statement and it was a little too inferential. So therefore they didn't know what I meant. So you can just follow it up with another declarative statement that gives further information. So you might say, I notice all the kids are lining up, but then the student you're with doesn't know how to decode that or they don't know exactly what you mean. So then I'm going to follow it up with, I think that means it's time to go into school. So I'm literally just decoding that context, giving them the information. When we see kids lining up, this is what it usually means. I know it and I want you to know it. And usually when you break it down that first time, chances are they're probably going to have it the next time around, and remember it on their own. I also think a lot about co-regulation. After Declarative Language Handbook, I followed it up with Co-regulation Handbook just because I really and truly use these two concepts together constantly. Like I'm never using one without the other. And it's just a matter of when I might use more declarative language, when I might pull in ideas of co-regulation a little bit. So I direct you to that, and I have resources on my website about co-regulation too, if you wanted to learn more about that. But essentially, for me, a lot of co-regulation is really creating partnerships with kids so that we're in things together and we create positive forward momentum towards our shared goal. But importantly, don't give up. I know changing our speaking style isn't easy, but it really and truly is worth it for so many different reasons. I just wanted to direct you to another blog post on getting started. So in this blog post, I just give you ideas to help you kind of get your feet wet if this is new for you. But the first thing is just really and truly noticing your own communication. So know that you don't have to start speaking in a declarative way all the time, every day, especially if it's not been your style. I know that can be hard. But a great place to start is just noticing how often you use imperatives, how often you use questions or that sort of thing. And then you can start small, maybe pick one context that you don't feel pressure or in a rush to try speaking and commenting or declarative statements rather than imperatives or questions. I want you to know it's okay to make mistakes as you give this a try. You can always rephrase and repair, just like we want our kids to learn. And importantly, be kind and patient with yourself. It's a process. I always think communication is a habit. And so if we're working to change our habits of communication, it just takes time and practice, but it is possible. And I just wanted to point you to a few more resources if you're interested. On my website, Linda K. Murphy, I have a few articles on declarative language. So these are just quick printouts. If you would just wanted to read a 2-page quick article or share it with someone else. So some of these are a little bit older now. So I think they're good for just beginning information and to share. But as I've said, my thinking and the way I talk about things just continues to evolve. But that's kind of how I talked about it in 2010, and they're just quick resources for you. Also, I have some articles on episodic memory, thinking beyond eye contact, which talks about the idea of visual referencing. So those are there for you as well. And then on declarativelanguage.com, I have many blog posts that you can explore to learn more. Declarative language, FAQs. I have a section on episodic memory, challenging behaviors. Taking it up a level talks about how we may use declarative language, for example, with mealtime or with the idea of interoceptive awareness, just for fun or just more playful ways to use declarative language so that you know it can be light and fun also. I have free downloads on my website that you can check out. So among them is that cheat sheet that I mentioned, and a few others. And again, if you want to learn more, there's some recordings, some different podcasts, so you can hear me talk more about declarative language or take it a little bit deeper, depending on the person I was talking with or the audience. And I'm happy to talk more now or answer any questions. I wanted to give you my email address too. So if you would like to be in touch with any questions, I always welcome that, because the more I hear from people, the more I know, what I need to talk about more, or just have different examples in real life so that I can continue to be practical and helpful as I talk with other people in the future. I'm going to take this down.
Great, thanks, Linda.
Sure.
There was one question that's already come through, and I invite people to either unmute and ask your question, or you can put it in the chat and I'm happy to ask it for you. But one question that came through was, how about motor planning as well? And how does that fit in with neuroprocessing?
Yeah, oh, Marjorie, you wrote that. Can you talk a little bit more about that question?
Sure. So it's obvious that my son has a processing issue when he says something, but and sometimes you could see him think about the questions you asked, but he also has to think about, okay, now I have to move. I have to kind of like get up and do the action that I'm supposed to do. So like and you could see the processing of the motor planning of that as well. So for example, if I would say, oh, Kyle, it's lunchtime. What do you want to eat? And he's processing like what he wants to eat. And then once he figures out what he wants to eat, then there's the motor planning of how to get that done.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it very much goes hand in hand, doesn't it? Um, and even when I think about, so I was talking about how declarative language supports processing of information, because we're just helping, for example, decode a context or make really clear what the other person might be thinking. But I also think declarative language can really help with motor planning, because say, for example, someone has they want to get from point A to point B, and there's an obstacle in the way, or just something in that makes it a different motor plan. Then you could use declarative language to say something like, oh, I know you're going to walk over to the fridge. I also noticed that there's a toy on the floor, so I'm thinking it would be helpful to walk around the toy rather than through it. So that might be an example of how you would use declarative language to support motor planning, just really and truly guiding in that moment on what the motor plan might need to be in order for it to be successful.
Is that helpful, Marjorie? Great. Another question that came through, what are some examples of how to use declarative language when a child is not compliant and there's a time constraint making wait time limited?
Right. So my first just like tip is to really and truly reframe that word compliant, because it sets the interaction up to be a negative one and a power struggle one. So first and foremost, if I offer an invitation to someone and they don't join, then in that moment in time, I want to figure out why. I want to figure out what might be going on for that person. I'm not going to assume that they're being stubborn or willful or that they don't want to. I really and truly want to understand what's going on for them in this moment in time. And even to pull in what we've talked about, like There could be a motor plan that is tricky, that is making it hard for that student to join. Or there could be new information and they need more time processing it. So I'll just give an example though of what I might do. So say for example, you are feeling a time pinch because you have to get to school or whatever it might be, and you want your child to put on their shoes, for example. So you might use the declarative statement where you could say like, "Oh, I noticed your shoes are by the door," but then they don't move. So in that moment, I'm not going to say like, oh, they just don't want to, they're being stubborn, they're not compliant. I'm going to think, okay, what might be getting in the way in this moment in time that makes it hard for them to travel to their shoes? Like, might it be initiation or energy or the motor plan? And how can I support in that moment? I would say quite often in that type of situation, when there's a time constraint, I'm going to pull in my co-regulatory strategies, which means I'm going to partner with that child and think about, and I know I talk about this more in that book, but essentially I want to think about how can we share this task at hand where I offer a competent role for the child, but also I have a role in there with them. So if they're having trouble getting to their shoes for whatever reason, then I might say, you know what? How about I go get your shoes? I'll bring them to you and we can put them on together. And then once we get there, it could be something like, how about if I can put on your right shoe and you can put on your left? Or I'll help you get them on your foot and then you can do the Velcro. Or you can hold up your foot and I'll help put it on. So you're always giving them a role in that moment that might be competent for them, but it's not the whole task, which for whatever reason was hard in that moment. And even in those moments, the decisions that I'm making are like my priorities. So if there's a time restraint and you just want to get to school, maybe that's not the time to put all the pressure on the self-care skill itself, but the priority instead could be on our connection together, transitioning out of the house and getting to school on a positive note so that the rest of the day goes well rather than starts with a power struggle where everybody doesn't feel good. So I just think about in those moments, how can I create positive forward momentum using partnership with this child?
Linda, I have another question.
Mhm.
Do you have some good behavioral interventions that you think you could pair with declarative language that could work? If you could give us some examples of some good
Mhm.
behavioral and declarative language.
Yeah. So again, if a child is having a behavior, the way I'm always going to view it is what is causing that dysregulation? Like what is triggering to that student in this moment in time? I think proactively, there's so many things we can do. Like we can use our own episodic memory to remember things that might be hard for a child so that we can set them up for success, like in future opportunities, or reflect with them. Like, I remember last week this was really tricky for you. Before it happens this week, I'd love to problem solve with you. So we can think about how we can do this together. So there's a lot of things that you can do outside of the moment that are going to support you in that moment. But I think when kids are starting to escalate, I have a handout on my website and it's called declarative statements that you can use when kids are starting to escalate, something like that. But really and truly, in my experience, when you start to see a child escalate, so some of the declarative statements that we talked about today are the ones that like we share memories or we problem solve or we have the opportunity to read a context. But when kids are starting to escalate, you don't want to use those types of declarative statements because they place a cognitive load on the individual when they're not in a place to take in that information. When they're starting to escalate or become dysregulated, like our primary goal in that moment is to support regulation. And in my experience, declarative statements that really and truly support regulations are those that validate the child's experience or mirror what they're communicating. So again, it's not that we don't want to problem solve, we're just prioritizing in that moment in time. So if I were to give you an example, like one time I was with a student and she really, really wanted to just like rip off her tights because they were bothering her. And she was escalating because this was really bothering her. But me, just as a speech therapist, I didn't feel it was my place to say, okay, you can rip your tights. You know, my goal was just to help her regulate until her mom was there, and then she and her mom could decide what made sense about her tights. So in that moment, you know, as she was saying, I just want to rip these off. I just want to rip these off. I just mirrored and I said, I hear you. I understand. These tights are really bugging you. You don't like how they feel. You want to rip them off. Um, and those statements helped her to regulate. And then once she regulated, then I was able to say, you know, I hear you that this is what you want. I just can't answer that question, but we can ask your mom when she comes back. So once she was regulated, she could hear that new piece of information and she could wait until she and her mom problem solved it from there. So I would say the declarative statements that really help the most when a child's escalating is those that validate and those that mirror without trying to push for any more, like your only goal is regulation. And sometimes when the child is really escalated, you just have to be quiet because you want to support their processing. And if there's too much information coming in, it's just going to overload them further. So sometimes when it's gotten to that point, you just have to wait quietly and help them be safe.
Thank you. Are there any other questions that people would like to ask? One second. Okay. Linda, thank you so much. Oh, wait. Oh, yeah. Just getting some thank yous into the chat. Thank you so much for coming today and for sharing your information. Lots of thank yous, great presentations coming into the chat. And we look forward to sharing out the resources that you are also offering. And I don't know if there's any final words you would like to share before we close out.
No, thank you again so much for inviting me to your community. It was really nice to be a part of this series and pretend that I'm in California for a little bit.
Thanks. All right.
Yeah,
Have a great day, everyone.
thank you. Bye.
Bye.